In the introduction to his book, How Not to Be Afraid, Gareth Higgins explores the fear he grew up with as a child in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He describes how he was afraid in his house, afraid in his country, afraid of his body, and afraid of God. Gareth was in his mid-30s before he realized there were other ways to live. Fear, for him, became a portal, which he describes as a doorway to a more exciting, peaceful, useful, whole life. He believes that part of why and how he found the portal is because of the experience of being overwhelmed by fear. We are living in a time when many are overwhelmed by fear. I met with one of my favorite rabbis here in Chicago this week, and she said she doesn't remember a time in all of her years as a rabbi when people in her community have been so afraid. I shared with her that I too have noticed increased fear in people I consider part of my communities, and even in myself. We talked about the Lenten study we're beginning, and she was very interested. I told her that today I'm focusing on the fear we grow up with, or the fear we're taught. At the Grownish adult group last week, we used this question as our guiding question for discussion. What were the fears you grew up with or were taught by your families? Some in the group said they don't remember being taught to fear, but they do remember somehow having fear instilled in different ways. I suggested that sometimes we learn things by observing more than by being explicitly taught. There were a range of fears that the group offered up. Some grew up fearing a lack of money. Some grew up fearing illness. Some grew up fearing sex and the idea that having sex, especially outside of marriage, would somehow condemn you to hell forever. Some grew up fearing that everyone they loved would die. Some grew up fearing anger. What do you remember growing up feeling afraid of? What were the fears that you were either taught or that you learned by observing? Some of you wrote in the Lenten meditation book about stories from your childhood that resulted in fear. I hope you will all read through the stories. Shannon emailed out the Lenten meditation booklet this past week, and if you want a hard copy, you can let her know that. I hope you'll all read through all the stories. What a beautiful and vulnerable offering our book is this year. I wrote a story about being afraid of the dark and why I was afraid of the dark. I'd like to tell more of that story. When I was in 3rd grade, my family moved away from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and lived for 9 months in Saratoga, California, which was 45 minutes south of San Francisco. My stepdad was traveling a lot for work, and sometime during that 9-month period, we had at least 3 occasions where my mom screamed in the night and woke us all up because of what she said were intruders. The police came 3 different times in a 1-month period. It was terrifying each time she screamed in the middle of the night. As a result of her claims that she had seen intruders, we got a German Shepherd guard dog who was named Vanessa, or Van for short. We also then moved down to the central coast of California and out to a 5-acre farm. We lived on that farm until my first year of college. In those 9 years, my fear increased. Nighttime was when my parents often fought, sometimes physically. Nighttime was when my parents would leave us alone and go into town to party. Nighttime was when complete strangers would knock on the door. You get the idea. Nighttime was a very scary time, and I assume because what had happened when we lived in Saratoga, I was afraid of the dark. I slept with a light on for years. After my older sister, with whom I shared a room, left for college, I would often go into my 2 younger sisters' room and sleep with them. My siblings used to tease me about being a scaredy cat, and I knew I was. Right after we moved into our house in the country, I had a bad accident on our quarter horse and was hospitalized with a broken arm and a broken leg. My parents left me alone in the hospital overnight in this town we had just moved to, and I was terrified. Not only were the lights in my hospital room turned off, but I shared a room with a young woman whose jaw had been wired shut and who moaned all night long. Terrifying sounds. I grew up believing that I was just more fearful than my siblings and always would be. Part of what Gareth Higgins explores in his book is the fact that how we tell our stories impacts how they work in us. He makes a case for how, in many ways, facts can tell us we are living in a safer time than at other previous times in history, and yet we feel much more afraid. Having access to constant news, the fact that bad news sells more quickly than good news, the fact that there are no gatekeepers, seemingly, for what gets published, and so it seems as if everything published is true, despite often not being contextualized, and the spread of misinformation on social media, all contribute to the story we tell ourselves about the world and our specific locations being less safe. He also points out that over time, many of us have learned to include more people in our sphere of those who matter, and so we experience more pain when learning about violence against people we may not know, but have come to believe are worthy of respect and life. Gareth writes, "It is true that each killing, each act of hate, each involuntary separation is a universe to the victim's loved ones. Solidarity with the suffering of others is both a part of the privilege of being human and a step toward a future in which no one will have to suffer that way again. And such solidarity seems to be growing. It is important not to deny these truths, that by many measures, the world is getting better, and that expanding circles of sympathy mean that more lives are considered worthy. It's also important to recognize that despite the reduction in violence and poverty and advances in health and communication, many of us don't feel good much of the time. Though we may not be living through an epidemic of increasing violence, we do seem to be experiencing an epidemic of fear. The most insidious of fear's powers is the ability to lead people to act violently toward themselves and others. Most of us have not physically harmed someone else, but we may have denied the fullness of another, withheld compassion from someone, or prevented our own flourishing because we have not been introduced to an alternative to the fear story. If you want to create chaos, teach people to be afraid. If you want to increase violence, give in to fear. But if you want to reduce violence, you can adopt practices that not only will make you less afraid, but could actually help everyone you meet to do the same. I want to repeat one of the things he said in that: if you want to create chaos, teach people to be afraid. Who does that sound like? If you want to increase violence, give in to your fear. Many of us were taught as children, and even sometimes as adults, to fear God. And I don't mean fear in the sense of having a healthy respect for God. I mean to be all out terrified that at any moment God could either strike you dead or consign you to hell forever. The story of Noah and the ark is taught as a cute children's story where we learn where rainbows come from and how God saved all of the animals. The reality is that the way this story is told, it is designed to teach us to be afraid of a God who would destroy all of humanity save one family in one fell swoop. And we're also, at the same time, supposed to be comforted by the same God who sticks a rainbow in the sky to remind that God to never again destroy the entire world of humans and more than humans, no matter how angry that God gets. As if God's memory were a little shaky. To make matters worse, this story has been told in many places and by many people that the evil God saw in humans was sexual and particularly homosexual. Never mind that it is nowhere in the story. Remember, so much of our fear stems from how stories are told or how we tell particular stories. This story, like so much of Genesis, was not meant to be a recounting of history, but a weaving together of various creation myths and flood myths of ancient cultures. Moving beyond the question of whether it's an historical account, Damon Garcia writes on inflesh.com, let's move beyond the question of this story's historicity and look for the arc that is crafted in this unique flood story. It begins and ends with a vulnerable God, a God vulnerable enough to change. This God is grieved by the corruption of humans, shows mercy to Noah and his family, unleashes a destructive flood, and then this God is grieved by God's own decision to unleash the flood and repents, promising to never destroy the earth and cut off all flesh again. One of the unique characteristics of the Israelite flood story is that God goes through these changes without the counsel of other gods. In the Israelite flood story, all this conflict between the gods becomes an inner conflict in one God. The idea of an immutable God, meaning unchangeable, is more influenced by Greek philosophy than anything. The unaffected, unchangeable, immovable God is an Aristotelian version of God that influential medieval Christian theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, adapted to argue for a God whose glory depends on God being first mover, or what is called the unmoved mover. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Fritz Rothschild inspire us to replace Aristotle's God with the actual God of the Bible, who isn't the unmoved mover, but instead the most moved mover. This is the God we see in the flood story. The covenant is rooted in God's ability to be affected by others. Garcia goes on to say, typically the flood story is justified with the assumption that God must have had a really good reason to kill everybody, and that everybody must have been bad enough to deserve it. This interpretation coincides with the colonial mindset of many churches that also justify violence around the world with the same assumptions. The colonization of the Americas is justified with the assumption that it was part of God's mysterious plan that transcends what we consider good and evil. The colonization of Palestine is justified in the same way. And today, as the Israeli government continues its genocide of Palestinians, many preachers justify the violence by assuming, like they assume about everyone killed in the flood, that they must be really bad. Instead of condemning violence, they try to find a way to believe the victims must have deserved it. There is no justification for genocide, though, even if God does it. We must be consistent across the world, across history, and across the Bible. There are no exceptions. How are we telling our stories of fear today? How are we telling stories in such a way that the intentional killing of other human beings and our planet is considered collateral damage for what God intends to happen? I agree with Damon Garcia when he says, there is no justification for genocide, even if God does it. We must be consistent across the world, across history, and across the Bible. There are no exceptions. This means we have to learn to tell the stories differently. In the case of God and Noah, why are we so afraid to tell the story, or what some of us are comfortable calling the myth, of a God who decided to destroy the earth and humans and all other living creatures, and then regretted it and vowed never to do it again? Why are we so afraid to tell the story of a God who makes mistakes and has regrets and seems vulnerable? Isn't this the God Jesus portrays while on earth? When I was a child, no one had language yet for what trauma was. The term post-traumatic stress disorder was first coined in 1980 and referred mostly to the impact of the Vietnam War on soldiers. It would be another couple of decades before it was used commonly for civilians who had experienced traumatic events. The story I told for many years was that I was afraid of the dark and I was afraid to be home alone. It was the same story my siblings told. I believed that story. It wasn't until I became an adult and then had my own children that I began to view my childhood very differently. When I was in the 5th grade, I knew my mom was an alcoholic, but it took many years and a lot of therapy to recognize specifically how that impacted me both as a child and as an adult. At some point in the past couple of decades, I began to recognize the amount of trauma I experienced as a child. When Emily, our oldest, was 9 years old, something clicked for me about the story of my hospitalization after my horse accident. As a parent, I could never fathom leaving my child alone overnight in a hospital in pain. I realized it was really a story about my own parents' dysfunction and abandonment, and not about my fearfulness. And it's also a story about the nurse who brought her boyfriend into my room after her shift and her assurance to me that they would stay with me until I fell asleep. With the two of them sitting by my bedside, I did finally fall asleep that night. All through my life, there have been angels who have shown up in my life and seen me through the darkness of night to the light of morning. I am, in reality, one of the most courageous people I know. And what if I had believed all along that I was really just a scaredy cat? It's important that I'm not telling stories about my childhood that convince me to believe that I am something I am not. My stories can go either way. They can either reinforce the idea that I'm afraid of everything, or they can tell the truth about the traumatic events that I experienced as a child. It's not that I don't feel fear. I'm like all of you. You know me well enough to know that I feel fear about many things. I could list them. I deeply resonate with Gareth, though, when he talks in his book about how we are telling the stories of our fear. What are the stories you are telling about your fear these days? And he asks a question that I think is a good one for all of us. What is the fear underneath the fear that you're telling stories about? What would happen if we told our stories more intentionally? How are Jewish people telling their stories right now of their growing fear of anti-Semitism? How are Palestinians telling their stories of their very real fear of ongoing genocide? How are we telling these stories that are not ours and yet are ours because there's no exception to anything or any story that would try to justify genocide? How are we telling the stories of our sacred scriptures in such a way that the story is about a God who loves from the beginning to the end, loves all people and all life, and is a God who is vulnerable and is the most moved mover? In a few minutes, we're going to spend some time considering our intentions for this 40-day season of Lent. One invitation is to consider the stories you are telling and whether or not you want to be telling any of your stories differently. We all feel fear because of danger, real or perceived, because of trauma, ours or the trauma of people we love, and because of experience. In this season of Lent, we will learn ways of living through the fear we feel. May God give us courage and creativity and an openness to new ways of telling our stories. Amen.